I never thought I would end up in this situation, questioning everything I believed in. My faith was always solid, a foundation that couldn't be shaken. Or so I thought. Pastor James had been the leader of our church for as long as I could remember, and he was everything a good pastor should be: charismatic, wise, and kind-hearted. But there was something different about how he treated me. At first I didn't think much of it. It started with simple things: a handshake held just a second too long, compliments that seemed a little too personal. "You have such a beautiful soul," he'd say with a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off, telling myself that he was just being kind, that I was overthinking things. After all, he was married, and I knew his wife Claire well. She was as devoted to the church as he was, always by his side at every event. It was unthinkable that he would ever cross any boundaries. But then came the late-night texts. They were never inappropriate, at least not explicitly, but something about the way he'd ask how my day was going, or send me Bible verses to lift my spirit at midnight, felt off. Why was I the only one he reached out to like this? I tried to ignore the creeping discomfort that grew with every message, convincing myself that it was all in my head. After all, I trusted him. He was my pastor. One Sunday after the service, Pastor James asked me to stay behind. I figured it was something to do with the youth group, which I'd been leading for a few months. But when I entered his office, the door closed a little too quickly behind me. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," he began, his tone softer than usual. "I want to make sure everything's okay. You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" I nodded, feeling a little uneasy. It was true that I had been pulling back, avoiding his texts and trying to limit our conversations to church matters. But now, sitting in his office, with the door closed and his eyes locked on mine, I didn't know what to say. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake, a tension that I knew we both felt. Then, he moved closer, pulling a chair next to mine. His hand gently touched my shoulder, and I felt my heart race. "You seem stressed. Maybe I can help you through it," he said softly. The room suddenly felt smaller, and I could feel the weight of his presence, his closeness. I wanted to get up, to leave, but something kept me frozen in place. I never imagined I would be in a situation like this. Pastor James was a man of God, someone I had admired for years. But now, here we were, sitting alone in his office, and everything felt wrong. And yet, I couldn't deny that a part of me felt drawn to him, to the comfort he seemed to offer in that moment. "Let's pray together," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. But this prayer didn't feel like the ones we shared in church, surrounded by others. This felt intimate, too intimate. My hands trembled as I took his. What was happening? Why couldn't I bring myself to leave? As Pastor James began to pray, his words were familiar, comforting even. But the way he held my hands tightly didn't feel like the kind of prayer I knew. His grip was firm, and his voice, though calm, carried a strange intensity. "God, we ask for your guidance in these times of confusion," he said. But I couldn't help but wonder who was confused, him or me? His hand slid from mine, lingering on my wrist for just a moment too long before letting go entirely. When the prayer ended, there was a heavy silence between us. I could feel the weight of his gaze, and it was as if we were both waiting for something to happen, something neither of us could fully admit. My heart was pounding, and I could sense the boundary between pastor and congregant starting to blur, if it hadn't already. I stood up quickly, desperate to break the tension. "I should get going," I mumbled, avoiding his eyes. He stood, too, moving closer, and before I could react, he placed his hand on my arm again. "You don't have to rush off. I want you to know that I'm here for you no matter what." His voice was calm, but his touch sent a wave of panic through me. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly acknowledge it, the connection that had been slowly growing between us. It was subtle at first, but now it felt like an unspoken understanding that neither of us could ignore. He was a man of God, and I was someone who had come to him for guidance, but it was becoming something else, something dangerous. I know you're here for me, but I think I need some space, I said, my voice shaky. His hand dropped, and for a moment I thought he would let it go, but instead, his expression softened, and he stepped closer, blocking my path to the door. I don't think you understand, he said, lowering his voice. I care about you more than you realize. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I could feel my pulse quicken as his meaning became clearer. This wasn't about the church anymore. It wasn't about me being a part of his congregation, or him being my spiritual leader. This was something deeper, more personal, and far more dangerous. I need to go, I said again, more firmly this time, but he didn't move. His eyes searched mine, looking for some kind of reassurance, as if he needed me to validate what was happening between us. For a split second, I felt the pull, the temptation to stay, to see where this would lead, but then reality hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a man and a woman standing alone in a room. This was my pastor, the man who had baptized me, the man who preached about faith and morality every Sunday. And here he was, standing too close, saying things that blurred the lines I had held so sacred. I really need to go, I repeated, pushing past him toward the door. He didn't stop me this time, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I left his office, my heart racing. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar sounds of the church, the faint murmur of people talking, the creak of wooden pews, brought me back to reality. But the encounter with Pastor James left me shaken. For days I avoided him, keeping to myself during services, sitting in the back of the congregation instead of my usual seat near the front. I ignored his texts and made excuses to skip any meetings that might involve us being alone. But I couldn't ignore the feelings that had started to grow inside me, feelings I didn't want to admit were there. A week later, I received a text from him again, but this time it wasn't just a casual check-in. "We need to talk," it read. "I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Should I ignore it? The boundaries had already been crossed, and I knew that if I responded, there would be no going back. But despite everything, a part of me wanted to respond. A part of me wanted to understand why this was happening and what it meant for us, if there even was in US. I hesitated for what felt like hours before finally typing out a response. "We can't do this," I wrote, my fingers trembling as I hit send. Almost immediately, his reply came through. "I know, but I don't think I can stop." After his reply, I felt a wave of panic. What had I gotten myself into? I'd always trusted Pastor James, but now it felt like I was trapped in something much bigger than I could handle. His words played over and over in my mind, making it harder to think clearly. "I don't think I can stop." What did he mean by that? Was it just a fleeting emotion or something more dangerous? I couldn't go back to his office. Not now. But the more I tried to distance myself, the more the situation began to consume me. Every Sunday, I'd sit in the back of the church, avoiding his gaze, but I could feel his eyes searching for me. I stopped attending youth group meetings and avoided any church functions where I might run into him. Yet, despite my efforts, I couldn't escape the turmoil inside me. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed again. Another message from him. "Can we meet? Just to talk. I need to explain myself." I stared at the screen, torn. Part of me wanted closure, some kind of resolution to this mess. But the other part of me knew that meeting him again, alone, was a risk I wasn't sure I was willing to take. I left the message unread, hoping he'd take the hint. But a few days later, during service, he approached me. It was subtle, just a brief moment when our paths crossed in the church hallway. "We really need to talk, please." His voice was low, almost pleading. I could see the tension in his face, the same turmoil I had been feeling. He wasn't the confident pastor I was used to seeing. He looked vulnerable, conflicted. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him, but only in a public space. "We'll talk at the cafe near the church," I said, making it clear that this conversation wouldn't be happening behind closed doors again. He agreed, and we planned to meet the following day. I arrived at the cafe first, nerves buzzing through me as I sat down at a small table near the window. A part of me was hoping he wouldn't show up, that this would all blow over, and we could go back to normal. But when I saw him walk through the door, my heart sank. This was really happening. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was palpable. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been struggling with this for a long time." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Struggling with what, exactly?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "With you, with my feelings for you. I know it's wrong, and I've been praying for guidance, but I can't seem to let it go. You mean more to me than just someone in my congregation." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some passing infatuation. He had feelings for me, feelings he couldn't control. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt flattered, in a strange way, that someone like Pastor James, someone who was supposed to be above all of this, had been drawn to me. But the rest of me felt sick. This wasn't right, and I knew it. "You're married," I said, trying to bring some sense of reality back to the conversation. "You have a wife, a congregation. You can't do this." "I know," he said quickly. "I love Claire, but it's different with you. I've never felt like this before, and I don't know what to do with it." I shook my head, trying to process everything. "You can't just act on these feelings. You're a pastor. You're supposed to lead us, not..." I stopped myself, unsure of how to finish the sentence. I didn't want to accuse him of anything, but the truth was there, hanging between us. He leaned forward, his voice soft but urgent. "I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. I just need you to understand how hard this has been for me. I don't expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know." I looked at him, searching for some sign of the man I had always looked up to, but all I saw was someone who had crossed a line, someone who had let his emotions get in the way of his responsibilities. This wasn't the man I thought I knew. "I don't know what you expect me to say," I replied, my voice shaky, "but this. Whatever this is, it can't happen. You need to focus on your marriage, on your faith. You can't keep dragging me into this." He nodded slowly, his face clouded with guilt. "I know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in this position." I stood up, ready to leave. "I think we need to keep our distance for a while. I'll still come to church, but I need space." He didn't argue. He just sat there, staring down at the table as I walked out of the cafe. I knew this wasn't the end of it. There was too much left unsaid, too much tension still hanging between us. But for now, I needed to get out, to breathe, and to figure out how I was going to move forward from here. Weeks passed, and though I tried to move on, the tension between Pastor James and me lingered like a storm cloud hanging over my life. I went to church less frequently, always sitting in the back, never staying for the after-service conversations. I didn't respond to his texts anymore, and though he had stopped reaching out as often, the few messages I received were filled with a weight that I didn't want to carry. "Are you okay? Can we talk? I miss our conversations." I ignored them all, knowing that responding would only pull me deeper into a situation I needed to escape. But it wasn't that easy. Every Sunday, I could feel his presence at the pulpit. His sermons, once filled with hope and inspiration, now felt heavy with unspoken words, and I couldn't help but wonder if the rest of the congregation noticed the change in him. One Sunday, after a particularly difficult service, I decided to stay behind. Not to talk to Pastor James, at least that's what I told myself, but to gather my thoughts in the quiet sanctuary. Most people had left, and the church was nearly empty when I heard footsteps approaching. My heart sank as I realized it was him. "I didn't think you'd stay," Pastor James said softly, standing a few feet away from me. His eyes were tired, as though the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. I stood up, ready to leave, but something in his expression stopped me. He looked defeated, broken in a way I hadn't seen before. "I just needed some quiet," I replied, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I'm not here to talk." He nodded, but he didn't move. Instead, he sat down in one of the pews, his hands folded in his lap. "I think I'm losing everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "Claire, the church? I don't know how to fix this." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to leave, to walk away, and let him deal with the consequences of his actions, but another part of me, perhaps the part that had always trusted him, felt sympathy for the man who had been my spiritual guide for so long. "You need to talk to Claire," I said gently, "not me." "I know," he sighed, running a hand over his face, "but I don't know how. I can't even explain what's happening in my own head. It's like everything's falling apart, and I'm the one causing it." I could feel the heaviness in his words, the weight of guilt that had been building for weeks, maybe months. He wasn't just struggling with his feelings for me. He was struggling with himself, with his role as a pastor, a husband, a man of faith. "You have to take responsibility," I said, my voice firmer now. "This isn't just about you, it's about everyone who looks up to you, who trusts you. You can't keep pretending like this will go away if you ignore it." He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something familiar in his eyes. The man who had once led me through moments of doubt and fear was still there, somewhere beneath the confusion and turmoil, but I also knew that I couldn't be the one to save him. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I've been avoiding it, hoping it would disappear, but it's not. I've been selfish, and I've hurt people like you." His words hung in the air, and I could feel the sincerity in them. He wasn't trying to justify his actions anymore. He wasn't trying to pull me into his confusion. He was admitting, finally, that he had crossed a line, and that it had consequences. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I let my feelings get in the way of what was right, and I know I can't take that back, but I need to make things right with Claire, with the church, and with myself." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of closure in his words. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was the one I needed. "I hope you do," I said quietly, turning to leave. "For everyone's sake." As I walked out of the church that day, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over, not entirely. There would still be whispers, questions, and maybe even rumors, but I had done what I needed to do. I'd walked away from a situation that could have destroyed both of us. Pastor James and I never spoke about it again. He focused on rebuilding his relationship with Claire, and I found my place in the church once more, though things were never quite the same. The trust one had in him was broken, but I learned that sometimes, even the people we look up to the most can falter, and in those moments, it's up to us to choose the path forward. And as for Pastor James, he remained at the church, but with a renewed sense of humility. He had faced his reckoning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he was finally ready to walk it, this time alone.